Good evening. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young, and welcome to Grace Cathedral Forum Online. Whether in political debates or discussions about immigration around the kitchen table, many Americans, regardless of party affiliation, will say proudly that we are a nation of immigrants. But are we living in a land of opportunity founded and built by immigrants? Or does this narrative of progress mask and diminish the United States history of settler colonialism, genocide, white supremacy, slavery, and structural inequality, all of which we are still grappling with today? My guest tonight is Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, an historian and the highly acclaimed author of An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, and most recently, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. As we continue our exploration of the Cathedral's theme of healing this year, we're going to be talking tonight about how embracing the more complex and honest history of the United States can lead to real healing. Roxanne, thank you so much for joining me. I didn't tell you this before we were talking ahead of time, but this is one of the most important books I've read in a very long time. I think it's like one of those lifetime books, where you kind of look at a certain stage of your life and there's a kind of book that kind of brings you back to that. That's definitely the way that I felt about your book. I was saying earlier that I was just reminded just my own ignorance in so many areas. And it was such an engaging account. I think perhaps one of the most important things for me in the book, you didn't even get to it until page 50, but you were talking about it all the way through. And that is the difference between what an immigrant is and a settler colonial. So an immigrant is somebody who arrives in a new land and has to adopt the cultural mores and the institutional structures and the ways of interacting and ways of socializing that is part of the dominant culture. And that's very different than a settler colonial person who basically makes up his own rules and establishes all those things for himself, even if that means oppressing the people who are originally there. Immigrants into a settler culture too, that's a kind of a problematic relationship too, is that as you immigrate to a settler colonial culture, you have to decide just how much you're going to go along with that program. And just that idea was so helpful. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, how that idea began to occur to you, how you became kind of conscious of that idea.
Yeah, well, I wasn't always. I grew up in rural Oklahoma, definitely settler, the segregation then, a white town. And there were immigrants there from Germany and Poland, but I realized later they were immigrants from the 19th century.
Yeah.
But they were still considered immigrants. They no longer spoke.
Exactly. How long do you have to be here before you're not an immigrant?
Exactly. And later I said, wow, we were still calling them immigrants. we were from old settlers, Scots Irish and been here forever. So that was, it was quite a while before that dawned on me. But, when I was doing my graduate work, I did my undergraduate, an MA, and then PhD in history. I kind of avoided US history because I think it was a reflex that everything that's been written is not right, but I have no idea really what it is, but it's boring. US history
right, exactly.
Boring. So I decided to do borderlands, which was, Latin America, the border, Mexico-US border, and got more into US imperialism. This was my first step, because you're doing Latin American history in a US university, you call it US imperialism.
Right.
I did, because of the border, I had to take a seminar, graduate seminar in US history, just to, because it was a border. It was now in the United States. And my dissertation went up to the present at that time. And I kept hearing these students and they're talking about manifest destiny. And why are they saying manifest destiny? I said, you know, that means imperialism, don't you? And the professor turned and said, are you a communist?
No. Oh, that's a terrible thing to say. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I said, what does that have to do?
Completely.
Anyway, I made a B in that, which is practically like, you can graduate school. Anyway, that kind of woke me up that something really wrong with the study. But it was actually it was the 60s. This was the mid 60s, and then it got to be the late 60s, and there's the civil rights movement. And I was a teaching assistant for the first Black history class. I learned, a great deal from Ronald Takaki was the professor.
Oh, yeah.
And I got interested in ethnic studies, his idea of, Takaki's idea of ethnic studies.
Yes,
he actually, started the first ethnic studies, Black studies. He got fired at UCLA where I was because of he was so popular. And he let Black citizens who weren't students come to his class. But he went up to UC Berkeley and, set up ethnic studies there. And then I got involved in legal work as an expert witness on the Wounded Knee trials.
Oh, right.
After the 1973. So I got educated by Native Americans, particularly Vine DeLoria Jr., who became a mentor, a Native lawyer and theologian, Episcopal theologian.
Right.
And then many others, the American Indian movement. And then I got involved in their international work and did that, for 30, 40 years while I was teaching and everything, and also taught. I decided instead of teaching in a history department, I would help build ethnic studies. So I taught ethnic studies and Native studies. So that's really, really how I myself was on a learning path. Now all this knowledge is available and out there, and people don't have great excuses
for being ignorant. Exactly. What is it?
But I'm always humble about it because I didn't know. Especially with older people who, didn't go through the 60s, and there's so much you can learn during a mass movement that would take years of study to learn. Just orally, the oral exchanges you learn from people, and we don't have many opportunities for that now.
Yeah, we don't. But that's why I think it's so powerful. It's just like this idea of a nation of immigrants. Like the way that's a problem to regard the United States project in that way, because it really does hide the fighting and the cruelty and the forced relocations. There's a way in which it kind of sanitizes American history, and I think that's the point of your book. And it's a really important point that we should never lose sight of. And I loved, your first chapter is on Hamilton, the musical, which I just thought I've been kind of waiting for somebody to write something like that. And I wonder, just, your argument basically is that Hamilton basically obscures these colonial agenda of the founding fathers of the United States. So it kind of hides the fact that many of them were Indian killers too, and were dispossessing people from their lands, and that the idea too that the Revolutionary War was connected to Great Britain's refusal to allow the colonies to expand, and colonists wanted to expand, and at the expense of the Indian tribes. So I wonder if you've heard back from anybody from Hamilton, from Lin-Manuel Miranda, or anybody about your critique.
No, I haven't. It was really interesting. I had been arguing against the Nation of Immigrants for a long time. Back in the, I wrote an essay for Monthly Review in 2005. They called, well, it wasn't an essay, it was a blog that they did.
Right.
And I call it really a rant. What I wrote was a rant. It was like, stop calling this a nation of immigrants.
Yeah.
But my sole argument and irritation was about how it covers up settler colonialism.
Yeah.
Say we're all immigrants, and then I found, its source, which I didn't know how recent it was. I thought that people had always thought that or said that.
Right.
It was in 1958, and John F.
Yes.
Kennedy.
I know, it was amazing for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was amazing for me too, because I was, mouthing off as not a nation of immigrants and putting it in books and articles I wrote without knowing that until I started research, when I was started writing this book. But Alexander Hamilton happened in 2015 was when it was a Broadway musical, and then it exploded. And it was, of course, I had to go see it in order to write about it. And of course, the music, the music and dancing and all is fine. But what people really loved was the message. It was the personification of Nation of Immigrants.
Right.
And it was like this great sigh of relief. Now we know who we are, because we were confused by all these, all of these tensions, and we're all a nation of immigrants, and this enthusiasm. And I thought it was very sad that a person from a colony, Lin-Manuel Miranda from Puerto Rico, called himself an immigrant.
Yeah.
He's from a colony. He's colonized.
Right.
He's not an immigrant.
Yeah, and your point about Alexander Hamilton was certainly not an immigrant. He was coming from one British colony as a British subject to another British colony, and yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. It's just so obvious, and yet that false consciousness is such a part of who we are.
It reinforced, it was. Well, this is what, that musical was also, it premiered in the White House. It was associated with Obama, and, Black men could be president. Look where that got us, where we are now. I mean, the ideology didn't work out too well. Yeah. So, Alexander Hamilton was, he's also portrayed as as heroic. The Constitution is portrayed as heroic, and I think has become, a kind of idealized. And I think telling the truth about him, how he established the fiscal military state, the capitalist state made for war. What was totally left out of that musical or anything about Alexander Hamilton in all of the biographies, which were all hagiographies.
Yeah.
Is that he was a military man.
Right.
He was a killer. He was the head. He's the one that brought the 30,000 troops.
Yeah.
To put down the whiskey rebellion, a settler rebellion. They didn't want to be taxed. They just fought a revolution to in taxation. And here, the new republic comes and taxes their whiskey. And
and your point is the room where it happens are plans for displacing human beings, and for even that idea of the settler, of the fiscal military state. I mean, just that was very helpful for me too. I mean, I just think that it's almost hard for me to imagine what capitalism would be like without that settler colonialism. It's almost hard to imagine. I mean, it's just like it's hard to disentangle the two threads,
Yeah, capitalism spread. Also, if you see in the United States, all the studies that have been made on the Cotton Kingdom in the last decade,
Yeah.
where you have to place the industrial capitalism as having originated far earlier than in the past, and the Northeast factories and all. In the Cotton Kingdom, and based on slave labor.
Yeah.
That in fact the first proletariat were enslaved Africans,
Right,
in the United States. So we've never had a proper trade union movement. That period of trade unionism, they were practically all, I would say 99% immigrants, Italian, Southern European, Eastern European immigrants, born somewhere else, and immigrant labor that they brought in, millions and millions. And so even our analysis that we do of why don't we have a powerful labor movement? Why don't we have at least attempts at workers' rights? No, capitalism is ingrained with settler colonialism in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you quote W.E.B. Du Bois just basically talking about how, it seems like such a contemporary comment that African-American and white laborers have everything in common, same goals, same aims, and yet that perception of racial difference is what makes it impossible for them to unify and to organize.
Yeah, and to admit that slave insurrections were workers' strikes.
That definitely woke me up. When you said that, I was just like, I just never thought of it in that way. But of course, yeah. It's about labor. There are labor actions.
Yeah, and it had an effect. It ended slavery. Insurrections made it impossible for slavery to continue. So it was no goodwill of Lincoln or whatever. They could see the writing on the wall that this was going to be maybe even a black nation in the South, like Haiti.
Yeah, right.
And those are so played down. When I took, it was Takaki that first made me aware of slave insurrections, because the theory was back then it was such a tight capitalist system, Eugene Genovese, that there were no revolts. And that's just a lie. There was constant insurrection.
Yeah. Yeah, which is why the slavers had such harsh measures. But that Thomas Piketty book on capital, I don't know if you read that, but his projections in terms of just like what the national wealth was, like so much, a massive part of it wasn't factories, wasn't farms, it was human beings. Which is a shocking thing. So back to Lin-Manuel Miranda, if you had to do a play, or a musical on Broadway, like what would you suggest for like the next project for them, for a story that you might think would be a good story to know about, that would maybe open people's eyes up to some of these things?
Well, there was a play back in the late 1960s called Indians. And it opened on Broadway. It didn't stay very long, but I happened to see it. I was living in Cambridge at the time, and I got invited to a preview before it went on Broadway.
Yeah, at the Brattle Theater?
It was not a big theater. It was only about 10 people. It was very exclusive.
Yeah.
And a friend took me. There's no way I would have been invited otherwise. Someone dragged me along.
Yeah.
Who knew so he just wanted to get a little bit of feedback, and
yeah, completely.
And I was just blown away by that play, and it was made into a movie called now I can't think of the name of the movie. But it wasn't a very good movie. It took the story. But I really think it's that building on that kind of play where Native people have agency.
Yeah.
It was a Sitting Bull story where Sitting Bull was, he was imprisoned, and then the Wild West show was able to get him to, and they promised he was a prisoner, but they allowed him to travel with the Wild West show and play himself. And so what it has in the play and in the movie, it's very good. Will Sampson played Sitting Bull, is he's speaking in his own language, and he's saying all these things that the translator is telling people, and huge crowds. This is a true story. Huge crowds of very poor, barefoot children and poor people, ragged white people, started coming and gathering around. And he would say, I understand why your government hates me because I'm their enemy. But why do they hate you?
Right.
And he was organizing them. So they took him out, then they assassinated him.
Yeah.
So that was, I think if that could be done again, that it would be, as a musical, it would work very well.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I'm so glad I asked you that, because we kind of moved on from the Hamilton conversation, but I didn't want to miss the answer to that question. We one of the things I love about your book is that you point out that so many immigrants are war immigrants. They're basically immigrants who are forced to immigrate because of some action that American military took overseas. So in Korea, in Guatemala, and Vietnam, all around the world. And I was thinking about you so much as I was reading this, because so much was unfolding with regard to the end of the war in Afghanistan. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just how that's connected to your thesis, and just, what did you notice in the press coverage over the last month about the things that are unfolding there?
Indian country.
Yeah.
That's what the term they use for war zone, U.S. war zone, Indian country. Every U.S. war is an Indian war.
Yeah.
Possibly World War I, World War II, which were not U.S. wars. They got involved, but they weren't in charge. So every other war, and the Civil War, which is domestic, every other war, and most of them get left out, were constant wars against Native people. Plus the invasion of Mexico, which taking half of it, which I consider an Indian war in the counterinsurgency. It always goes to counterinsurgency, not engaging the armed enemy, which Native people were. They were armed, they were fighting, they had soldiers. The US Army would go to the camps where old people, children, and and to villages, and burn the crops, burn the homes, kill civilians. So that's what US calls wars, Indian wars, but actually they were genocidal, counterinsurgency, bloodbaths. Just even during the Civil War, which is always left out of the period of the Civil War, you wouldn't know that the largest single massacre took place during that time. 324 Shoshones killed by the Union Army. The Navajos, on their march, the long walk, were forced by the US Army. They commissioned Kit Carson as an Army colonel to carry it out, that mercenary Indian killer, to be, during the whole Civil War, in a concentration camp where half of them died.
Yeah.
And then the Dakota, so-called Dakota War, where the Dakota people did attack these settlers that were coming in and they were village people, they were farmers, simply taking over these Scandinavian immigrants who were given, recruited and brought by the US government, given some tools. And here they're in the middle of other people's territory.
Yeah.
And the US, Lincoln's Union Army went in and drove them out. And it was the largest mass hanging in US history of whoever they rounded up could catch. Everyone else, they ethnically cleansed. All of that just during the 4-year Civil War.
Yeah.
And it's never, the connection's never made, that the Confederates were also in the West killing Indians and trying to
Right.
their land.
Well, it's so shocking to think that this horrifying Civil War, you couldn't even interrupt the wars that were on the native peoples to fight another war.
No.
It's like both wars are happening simultaneously.
They didn't miss a beat. Yeah, they just continued. And then went all out afterwards. It became the Army of the West. And one connection that people don't usually make that is so important is that why did Reconstruction fail? Because they took the army out. Why did they take the army out? To put them in the West.
Right.
6 of the 7 divisions of the US military, the army, was transferred to the West. And so that's how we got Jim Crow.
Yeah, that was such a powerful section. Like we were saying before we went on air, it was a huge moment in American history, and it was deeply influenced by that imperialist impulse. One of the things I thought a lot about is just, you point out that the whole history of immigration laws basically they started in basic racism. So you're talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so it's almost like the foundation of all of our immigration system is kind of built on that foundation of racism. I mean, like, how is it possible to reform such a system? And what ideas do you have for making it a more humane thing?
Well, every administration is the same. There's bipartisanship on exclusion and contingency, making it miserable and difficult to migrate or immigrate to the United States. And it did start with exclusion of Chinese, the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1884, the first immigration law was exclusion. And the second was to extend that to all Asians. Like 3/4 of humanity was excluded.
Yeah.
But that didn't mean they didn't come. The manufacture of undocumented immigrants is intentional because they're contingent. They can be deported.
Right.
They have to work without papers, without any benefits, without any kind of security or trade unions. So that's intentional. And making it for the Chinese, they're building the railroad at the same time that they're excluded.
Right, exactly.
The capitalists are recruiting Chinese men, not their families, the men, to work. And of course, by then, and I go through this whole thing in the Yellow Peril chapter, they had started with Marco Polo, deciding that China had to be destroyed or controlled because it just was too organized and productive, and they could never compete with it. So there was Europe set out, and the United States, when it became a independent state, joined in this, and ended up imposing opium the opium trade, opium wars, lots of addiction, China. They had made a basket case out of what had been one of the most vibrant,
orderly societies.
orderly trading,
Yeah.
not interested in expanding, simply trading.
Yeah.
And so they were in that condition that people were starving. That's why they were coming, going in different places, going to Latin America, anywhere to be able to send funds back to their families. And so this was, this double thing of contingency and the immigrant being constantly on alert. Like I said, always an immigrant.
Yeah. Yeah. I love what you quoted Leland Stanford, just like saying these just outrageously racist things when he's governor of California about how important it is to exclude the Chinese. And then when he's like the robber baron, like setting up the nation's railroad system, he's hiring them all.
And saying what good workers they are.
Yes, exactly. That was such a horrifying section to think about how the United States destabilizes foreign countries, even ones that you may not think as being on the regular list.
Well, this comes up to the present, and possible nuclear war on the horizon surrounding China with gunboats like the 19th century. It's very, very scary because there's still, this was the whole thing about Afghanistan. Let's get out so we can go to China.
Right. I mean, you're right. Back to that. Yeah.
Yeah. And they were talking, even during that chaotic evacuation, they're talking about, China's going to, newscasters, China's going to take advantage of this. It's on the border, they're going to take advantage. I doubt that that's the first thing on their mind, that they want to.
Right. Well, even just I mean, instead of being kind of repentant and just saying, maybe this idea of military involvement in other countries is a terrible thing. Instead of that, like that kind of reflection, you're right. It's just like all the fear-based thing of just like, well, who are we in danger from? That was another thing you just mentioned. You just only put it like a sentence or two in it, but that sense of almost kind of compulsion, like a paranoia about being not safe from other countries when we have this massive military and just this feeling of we're still never safe and we'll never be safe, and just like that idea of controlling other people as an excuse for not feeling safe yourself that was a really powerful section in the book too.
Yeah, there's this built-in paranoia into U.S. nationalism that everyone wants to take over the United States. I know when I was growing up, it was, the Cold War, and the maps in, grade school, they had a map of the world, one of those kind of flat maps that kind of skew thing.
Yes.
And they had the Soviet Union bigger than it actually is, but it was red and it was dripping blood.
Oh, yeah.
Down into the United States.
Yeah.
It was terrifying. I mean, it scared kids. And of course, we were having bomb, raids.
Shelter, exactly.
Yeah, to get in the cellar.
Right. Oh my goodness.
So it is really, there is this paranoia that Hofstadter wrote about, the paranoid mind. I don't think he really got to it because he never really understood settler colonialism.
Yeah.
And also the wars, because they ignore these, this constant warfare. That's how the U.S. Army was built. Even by the Civil War, they had already had since 1607 building up, wars to fight Native people.
Yeah.
And so they fought that counterinsurgency against the South, the Civil War. They used all the same techniques on the South that they had used in the three wars against the Seminole Nation in Florida and against Mexico.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
so it's built in. It's a very militaristic state. And, there's this great pride in separation
Right.
the military, the independence of the
The
military.
civilians and yeah, you're right. That's another element, but it kind of it hides a deeper truth.
Yeah, we don't think of the United States as militaristic, but that's really problematic because it's it's hard to imagine the United States without war, and until we can understand that, I personally think maybe I'm idealistic, but I come from a very poor tenant farmer family. It's not, it's a learning process. I know I've been able to learn that and confront these things, that until we do, we can't possibly figure out how to change, like the immigration policy.
Right.
It will go on, just like it is, just miserable at the border. And people who come really believe the rhetoric of the United States, that not only is a nation of immigrants, but it's a country of liberty and open arms.
Yeah, well, the dream of the American dream. The
American dream.
Yeah.
And of course, they're often fleeing violence, but fleeing poverty.
Yeah.
But they also think, this is the first place they think of to come because it's supposedly this very welcoming place.
Yeah. One of the things I've just been dying to ask you about, because I think you understand this better than anybody else I can think of, but just back to that militarism in the militaristic society. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like guns and gun culture and how that the kind of the politics of our contemporary gun culture is connected to that settler colonialism.
Yeah, I wrote that book, Loaded.
I know. I want to read it now. I'm going to check it out of the library.
Yeah. It's a disarming history of the second.
I thought that was a great subtitle too.
It was the editor's creation. I thought it was brilliant. It's something I've always known. And the editor, City Lights, asked me to write it. And I wrote that book faster than any book I've ever written, just because I've been saying that. All I had to do was write down what I've been saying, that, you can't separate the militarism from the civilian gun nuts.
Yeah.
That this is, and also a profile of who are the multiple gun owners.
Right.
An average of eight armed, those who own guns own an average of 8.
Wow. That's amazing.
But only 1/3 of the population owns even one gun.
Yeah.
So you start reducing this and then profiling, and you get a vast majority of white men. And then you look into some of them. I got a lot of names from the insurrection, January 6th, that I started researching. Almost all descendants of original settlers.
Interesting. That's so
it comes down to that. That's where the gun culture is still in those people who are living the excitement of killing Indians, and taking land and being settlers, It spreads. People in the last year, I don't know if you know, that gun sales practically doubled because, for one, they were considered essential businesses.
Oh, I still don't understand that.
I was blown away by that. I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh.
And essential business. But they couldn't keep enough stock enough guns in stock to keep up with the demand. But it's grown far, far worse. I haven't even done the new statistics, but the ones are old in my book, because it's much, much worse than that now.
it all makes me too wonder just about just the gun lobby and gun manufacturers and arms manufacturers. And that was another thing that you talked a lot about, is just the kind of thinking of the police departments as being kind of having a hereditary relation to the slave patrols, and then the use of military equipments in regular police forces. That was, it wasn't something that was new, but it was very helpful for me to see that through line.
Well, in something I didn't figure out in Loaded that I did when I started doing the chapter on Irish immigration, the famine refugees were the first. These were the first. You couldn't really call them immigrants because they were desperate refugees. But in fact, most people we call immigrants to the United States are refugees from mostly U.S. wars.
Yeah.
In the case of the Irish, it was the U.S. British colonization and starvation, the potato famine, of course, which was induced intentionally.
Yeah.
They really wanted to ethnically cleanse Ireland and get people out so they could settle it, settler colonialism in Ulster. So that took a century to bring about this crisis. But how the Irish were the first immigrants that had to be, they did have the advantage of being fair, big white, and speaking English. Unlike the future, Italians and Eastern Europeans, Catholic and Jewish, and spoke different languages, didn't know English. So they had those advantages, but they came at a time when city police forces were, and of course slave patrols were really ramping up. They had always existed since the 1680s, but they were really ramping up as in the Cotton Kingdom, and with even more insurrections. And so the Irish were recruited, and also in the military, the Irish were recruited. This was the way they were Americanized into police forces, into the military, into slave patrols. So today, it's almost a cult, an Irish cult. Police forces. They have the Emerald Society, secret societies. The police unions are largely controlled by Irish Catholics. Not the Scots Irish are another problem. They're the settlers, but the Irish Catholic descendants of immigrants, and of course more immigrants came, but the largest number that reproduced came in that crucial time. And of course they were pressed into the war against Mexico, 648, and then into the Civil War. So, but that, that seasoning, what I call the seasoning of immigrants that then produce, certain things. And then the Italians, their seasoning was to give them Columbus as an ancestor.
That was one of the things I wanted to ask you too, is just, here we have Columbus Day coming up. And I just wondered, what kind of suggestions you have just for like an alternative? Because what I loved about your story really quickly about Columbus was you basically took somebody and you kind of made them whiter and made them more of a representative of just all Americans, and made them as a kind of like a representative of certain immigrant groups who came. So it's like a myth of Columbus that was assembled, since Italians first, well, even before Italians started, but gathered steam when Italians immigrated to America. But how might we just be more intentional about having like a day that replaces Columbus Day, maybe some other time of the year in the calendar, but honors the nations that were here in the United States before Europeans arrived?
Well, there has been a big movement for many years. Native Americans, I would say it dates back at least to the early 60s of the Red Power movement, to demanding an end to Columbus Day.
Yeah.
As a colonizer, a genocider, the onset of celebrating the onset of colonialism in the world, not just in
right, you're totally right. I mean, a new era of exploiting people far away for.
Yeah, and it's a symbol of that. And here you are celebrating this symbol. So it's been replaced by Indigenous Peoples Day.
Yeah, exactly.
I think there are 18 states now of the United States, including conservative ones like South Dakota, but they have, a large population of people
exactly,
who do not celebrate Columbus. They celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day on that date. And lots of cities, even, I don't know, dozens and dozens of cities and towns, counties, universities. So a mass movement is really going on to face. Now, the problem is that this was created for Italian.
Oh, Roxanne, you're covering up your microphone.
There
you go.
They are, it was definitely a gift, to assimilate Italians, Americanize them. It was made a federal holiday by Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
But it was the founding of the Knights of Columbus in 1882 that began. I mean, it was the Knights of Columbus who were Irish.
Right.
The founders were Irish, not Italian, because there weren't the Italians hadn't come in great numbers.
They hadn't arrived yet, exactly.
Hadn't arrived yet. But there was the Knights of Columbus for when they did arrive to Americanize them through Columbus, because that had already been done. That was already in action with the Catholic Church trying to domesticate itself as an American church and be accepted. Remember, this was a Protestant, Anglo-Protestant country.
Yeah.
Hated Catholics. I was Southern Baptist, and we were taught that the Catholics were devils. So, they said that from the pulpit, the Antichrist. So, that was more recently, I think it probably still goes on, although the Catholic Church has Americanized itself. Look at our Supreme Court.
Right, completely. That was a great outcome.
But that was a lot of work. And then 1892 came along, the 400-year anniversary.
Right.
So the Knights got really busy, and by then there were Italians coming in. And they had the White City in Chicago celebrating Columbus. But one thing that surprised me in my research is I had no idea how far back the Columbus affinity went.
Yes.
And the colony, 1726, is the first time I could find that a town was named Columbus in South Carolina. And then more and more, there are hundreds of them, Columbia and Columbus. Right. The District of Columbia, they actually, the founders actually debated what maybe naming what became the United States Columbia.
Wow.
But instead they called the site District of Columbia and named it the United States.
Yeah.
And so it really goes deep in the colonial mythology of the United States. So when it, then it was all in place for these Italians who are coming. They're really Sicilians and from Southern Europe, very dark people.
Yeah.
Very discriminated against. They were treated horribly by unions, by fellow workers. They wouldn't hire them because they didn't speak English. They're small in stature. They Catholic, and so this was and Theodore Roosevelt had a lot to do with it. He gave speeches constantly for Knights of Columbus and for that these are people who are descendants of Columbus. They're Catholic and Columbus was a Catholic.
Right, of course. You know, we have a tradition actually of taking questions on for people who are watching. And we have one comment that I want to share first and then the question after that. So the comment is this: one of Roxanne's former students wants to share, quote, "I took 2 Native American studies courses from you in the 1970s when at what was then called Cal State Hayward. You were a tough, fair, straight-talking professor who shaped my thinking and values for life. Thank you."
Okay.
Great. I love to have. What a wonderful student to have. And now here's another question. Do you have any hope for the forthcoming, quote, "Killers of the Flower Moon," filmed in Oklahoma this year? It's an upcoming American Western crime drama directed and produced by Martin Scorsese and written by Eric Roth, written based on the nonfiction book. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I didn't read the book, but I think it got a lot of high praise. So you never know how things translate into a movie.
Yeah.
But it's a true story about the horrible corruption of the oil kingdom in Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma. It's still all oil. Everything's about oil.
Yeah.
I've always had this fantasy of being able to float above Oklahoma and have, like a science fiction thing, have those beamed eyes.
Right, exactly, like Superman.
And I would see the entire earth there underneath our oil pipelines, most of them leaking.
Yeah, right. It's true.
But they now have earthquakes in Oklahoma.
Oh, I know. It's terrible connection. On the last page of your book, you quote Donald Trump, who's criticizing Howard Zinn for, quote, "trying to make students ashamed of their own history." And my question is, why is it so hard for Americans to admit they were wrong and to begin to atone for some of these horrible things that it's not hard to find out about, how the United States government has treated Native Americans. So why are Americans so resistant for taking responsibility, for apologizing, for actually, doing something like providing some form of reparations for peoples who've been displaced?
Well, I think the lack of knowledge, which most people don't have much control over, what gets in the textbooks, what gets taught, that they're not getting the real story. So it's very hard, I think, to know if you don't have certain pieces. It goes back so far, to the very origins of the country. But people do respond, and we can tell that with the Black Lives Matter led demonstrations last summer.
Yeah.
It's massive. I mean, in little rural towns in states that, what you call red states, Oklahoma, when I saw, this tiny town that I know in Oklahoma, that they had turned over one of those tanks that the police had, gotten from the military, that surplus military stuff. It turned it over, a group of young people there in that town, little white town. And so I think people do, that was evidence, it was short term.
Yeah.
But they responded when that's what I mean by, these mass demonstrations like that. It's a quick learning process that you can't get just out of books. I tried with An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States and this one to provide all these connections, the pieces of the puzzle.
Right.
But I find that people feel liberated by truth.
I agree. The truth will set you free.
Rather than oppressed and saying, "Oh my God," rather than guilt, saying, "Damn, anger." Like,
yeah, exactly.
I've been fooled,
Yeah.
No one likes to be fooled. So I think it's, a lack of knowledge. Beacon Press is a wonderful press owned by the Unitarians.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah.
Things. There's no way a New York publishing house would publish, my books. They publish good books, but they don't really go to the crux of the matter.
Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, I mean, you were part of such an important movement in the United States of just the development of ethnic studies in the American universities. And I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about just what are some of the exciting new possibilities that you see in ethnic studies today, and how has it evolved and changed for the better over the years?
It's been so important. I feel so honored that I had the opportunity, just being a teaching assistant for Ron Takaki, who had this already in mind, even though he's trained in history, and setting up and, actually working on building a department. I feel privileged because every course I ever taught, I designed myself.
Yeah.
Designed the curriculum. Not many, we all did doing ethnic studies. It hadn't been done before. And I remember we didn't have many texts. I had to teach against the text. I would assign text and say, now we're going to read this critically.
Yeah.
And put things together, Xerox different things and make books, literally.
Yeah.
We all were in that process. And then, of course, good literature started coming out. And so I think it was so important because it has, now in the Ivy Leagues, history departments are now finally, they're not developing ethnic studies, but they're hiring excellent people, Native American scholars. And of course, African scholars have been for a while, in the Ivy Leagues. And what the Ivy Leagues do, it kind of dribbles down to the state universities and to private schools and all. So it's taken a long time, the process, but I think without the ethnic studies is the base for to build upon. And they're thriving still. They're really, these departments, there are a lot of places that have, no one wants to study history and English.
No, the classics, yeah.
Liberal arts anymore, but they never have problems filling classes in ethnic studies. They're thriving in universities. So what that's doing to other departments is they're introducing more courses that, so it affects everything. It's not an isolated thing. And you can get PhD in ethnic studies that are very honorable degrees at all the UC campuses, and in most states, at least in the West, you can get the doctorate in ethnic studies.
Yeah, we have the former chair of the Black Studies Department at San Francisco State as part of our congregation. She's just so inspiring. I learned so much from her almost every conversation I have. So you're right. It's a field of knowledge that it's important for us to understand and know about. And I think people are interested too.
And it was a big fight in San Francisco State.
Oh, I know. I think of her just being in such a historic.
Leader.
Yes, completely. Oh my goodness. I know. It's just, and people who really persevered and had this imagination and dreamed this future were able to make something that we're all beneficiaries of now, so many years later.
Yeah. And every year they celebrated and renew teach new students the process they went through to create that.
Yeah, that was why I was so glad that we had a few other questions that came in, but I was so glad to see one of your former students wrote in. It was very, very sweet of that person.
That person was there in the beginning when, we had these readers. We created.
Yeah, completely. Go pick them up at Kinko's copy machine company.
He was one of our guinea pigs.
Yeah, right, exactly. But I'm absolutely astonished by how fast the time went. It feels like we've only been talking for 5 minutes, but
yes,
an hour. I wonder just to close things up, if you could just tell us just some signs of hope that you're seeing on the horizon, just some things that are that you're noticing that might give us reason for hope for the future.
Well, it's pretty hard these days.
I know it is, isn't it? It's so hard.
Congress in action.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I
God.
don't know, the lack of empathy for that Joe mentioned, to say that he's afraid of people getting too many entitlements. This entitled white
that
man
breaks my heart.
billionaire. I
Completely.
wanted to slap him.
Yeah, exactly.
But I do think that I was really energized by the demonstrations last year, and I think we have to create that momentum that lasts.
Yeah.
You know, that it can't be probably that I don't know, intense, but a momentum that becomes our daily normal thing, you know, to create community. Because it's interesting, the pandemic in some ways has brought us together, those of us who are progressives, in ways that I think has been, you know, we've been able to, I don't know, really gain a lot of ideas and thinking, and we see on the horizon more pandemics, because we have climate catastrophe, which
Oh, Roxanne, you're frozen. I wonder if I'm frozen. Roxanne? Oh, well, the technology failed us, but I'm so grateful for Roxanne's comments tonight and for her book. It really is worth reading. If you get a chance to read Not a Nation of Immigrants, I recommend it very highly. Please join me next week when my guest will be Bishop Megan Rohrer. She's the first trans bishop of any major religious denomination in the world. She was consecrated here, or ordained here at Grace Cathedral a couple of weeks ago. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give on gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278, 76278. And thanks again to Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz and for joining us at Grace Cathedral on the forum. Good night.